41 years ago, a 10-year-old boy vanished from the ball field in the town of Chillicothe on a weekend afternoon, disappearing without a trace and leaving his family in agony. Authorities suspected a strange man, who had been lingering near the field and who also vanished right after the incident, was involved. But with no body found and far too little evidence to pursue, the investigation eventually stalled. Yet through all those years, the boy's older sister never gave up hope, clinging to the slim chance that her little brother was still out there somewhere. Then one day, a middle-aged man, looking through his own old papers, discovered a crucial detail that everyone had overlooked for decades. A detail that would upend the entire case and shock everyone involved in a way no one could have imagined. Before we dive into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy this video, don't forget to subscribe. Ohio in the early 1950s was the picture of post-war small-town America. Life moved slowly, communities were tight-knit, and kids routinely played outside unsupervised without anyone worrying about unseen dangers. The town of Chillicothe, surrounded by fields and quiet roads leading out to the countryside, was a perfect example. A church, a school, a ball field, a local grocery store, and peaceful residential streets made up the simple rhythm of life for the people there. In that world, the Walker family was typical working class. Henry Walker worked at an auto repair garage, usually coming home smelling of grease after the sun had started to set. Lorraine Walker earned money sewing at home, diligently working at her machine by the window where she could keep an eye on her son playing in the yard. They lived in a modest one-story house with an old wooden fence, nothing fancy, but warm and comfortable by the standards of the time. Their only son, 10-year-old James Walker, was an active, curious boy like most kids his age. James loved running to the ball field near the house every afternoon to join pickup baseball games with the neighborhood kids. He was especially close with his same-age friend Peter Miller, and was a favorite of old Mrs. Chapman, the neighbor who often sat on her porch, watching the children play. Plenty of people in town knew James. He was polite, quick, and always willing to run errands for the adult. Everything was normal, until something strange started to disrupt that peace. For several days in a row, people noticed a strange green Ford parked near the baseball field, in an odd spot, as if the driver was watching something. A few residents saw a strange man in or around the car, but the idea of a child predator simply wasn't part of people's thinking back then, so no one treated it as a real threat. To kids like James, a stranger's presence wasn't enough to raise alarm. In Chillicothe, adults talking to children was perfectly ordinary. On the afternoon everything changed. James headed to the field as usual to meet his friend. The kids played amid laughter and shouting, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. For one brief moment, the baseball rolled far away from the group, and James ran after it. He separated from the others at a moment when no one was paying attention, and that was exactly when the strange man appeared from the edge of the field. No one knows exactly what was said, only that James stopped to listen to the man, then took a few more steps toward the green Ford parked in the shade of the trees. The boy didn't scream, didn't struggle, didn't make any sound that would draw attention. When the other kids finished their turn and looked around for James, he was gone. No one saw him leave the field or walk off with anyone, and no one saw the car drive away. It happened so fast that the kids just assumed James had headed home early, something he sometimes did. But as dusk fell, James still hadn't come home. Lorraine started to worry when she noticed how late it was getting. At first she walked around the front yard calling his name, figuring he might be playing somewhere nearby in the neighborhood. The more she looked, the more her worry grew. No one in the area had seen him. When Henry got home from work, he and his wife immediately started searching all the familiar places, asking every child and every family nearby. The kids said James had left the field for a minute, and then no one knew where he went. What started as concern turned into panic as the family and neighbors searched streets, lawns and playgrounds with no sign of him anywhere. Night fell, the calm atmosphere turned suffocating, and something the people of Chillicothe had never imagined began to feel real. A child in their town might have been taken by a stranger. Once they were certain this wasn't just a case of being late, Henry and Lorraine called the police, setting off a chain of events and an investigation that would change their families' lives for decades to come. When Henry and Lorraine's call came in, the Chillicothe Police Department immediately logged it as a missing child report, something never taken lightly, even though the concept of child abduction wasn't as widely recognized then as it would be decades later. The dispatcher quickly asked the necessary follow-up questions to gauge urgency: James's age, the last time he was seen, the exact location, and anything unusual surrounding the disappearance. The fact that James was only 10, last seen at the ball field, and had separated from his friends without anyone noticing, led police to treat the first hours as absolutely critical. Within minutes, the case was upgraded to high priority, and a detective team was sent to the Walker home to confirm details before heading to the scene. When the detectives arrived, Henry and Lorraine were still in shock and repeated everything they knew. James had left that afternoon to play ball as usual, showed no odd behavior beforehand, and had no history of wandering off or leaving town without telling his parents. They also mentioned hearing from neighborhood kids that James had stepped away from the field briefly in an unknown direction. The team took detailed notes, quickly checked the clothes James was wearing when he left, his height, distinguishing features, and anything he usually carried. Once the initial information was confirmed, they headed straight to the ball field, the last place he was seen. At the field, they taped off the area to keep residents from accidentally disturbing evidence. Even though the field was in the middle of a residential neighborhood, establishing boundaries was essential to preserve any physical traces. The investigators walked the area where James had separated from his friends, examining the ground, trees, and any possible footprints or tire marks. One group focused on the spot the kids described, where James bent down to pick up the ball, while another checked the paths leading away from the field. It didn't take long to find clear tire tracks in the dry dirt at the edge of the field, tracks that didn't match the vehicles normally parked there. The depth and direction of the tracks showed the car had stopped briefly, then accelerated away. Nearby, they found an adult-sized shoe print, pointing in the same direction James was believed to have walked. The print didn't belong to any of the kids who had been playing and appeared to have been made right around the time James vanished. While searching further, they discovered a small item under some grass, an old baseball card that matched the collection Henry said James always carried in his back pocket. There were no signs of a struggle or resistance at the scene, which supported the idea that James left the area calmly or was taken so quickly he had no chance to react. The team marked key locations within a radius around the field: the suspected approach point, where the car was parked, the direction it left, and the distance from the field to the roads leading out of town. They concluded that if a vehicle was used, whoever took James could reach quiet back roads in just minutes and disappear unnoticed. All of this was carefully documented in the crime scene diagram: James's last known position, the tire tracks, the footprint, and where the baseball card was found. These scattered but significant details were enough for an initial assessment. This was not a child who ran away or simply wandered too far. Instead, everything pointed to an adult being present the moment James separated from his friends, and a vehicle being used to remove him from the area. For the investigators, this was grounds to treat the case as a probable abduction and immediately expand the search and response before more time erased additional evidence. The tire tracks, adult shoe print, and location of the baseball card found at the ball field became the focal points for the investigation team, and from there, the crime scene analysis went deeper to determine exactly how the stranger approached James. The tire marks were slightly off the main entrance to the field, in a spot rarely used for parking, suggesting a deliberate choice. The direction of the tracks showed the vehicle entered from a small road to the east, and left the same way, keeping the trip short and minimizing exposure to residents. The tire marks were a reasonable walking distance, a few dozen steps for an adult, from where James had been standing. This supported the theory that the man didn't drive right up to the kids, but parked at the edge and approached on foot to avoid drawing attention from the group or nearby homes. The adult shoe prints near James's last known position only went one way, from the parked car toward the field, with no prints heading back. There were no scuffs, drag marks, or crushed grass that would indicate a struggle. The team noted this was a quiet, low-profile approach that provoked no unusual reaction from the victim. The baseball card lying in the grass was the only item belonging to James left behind, reinforcing that he had little or no time to react. From these traces, the suspect's approach took shape. The stranger came from the car, walked straight to where James was momentarily alone, interacted very briefly, then led the boy back toward the vehicle. This method fit the profile of someone trying to minimize the risk of being seen. The preliminary analysis showed the perpetrator likely knew the area's routines, chose a concealed parking spot, and waited for the moment the kids were separated. The use of a vehicle became clearer from the tire tracks and the short distance to the nearest quiet road, a road with little traffic and no clear sightlines from nearby houses, perfect for leaving unnoticed. The depth of the tracks suggested the car hadn't waited long, consistent with someone actively waiting for a target. The distance from the edge of the field to where the tracks showed acceleration also indicated urgency to leave rather than a casual stop. All details were recorded on the crime scene diagram: James's last position, where the baseball card was found, the direction of the adult footprints, the parking spot, and the escape route. That diagram became the foundation for testing every theory. By studying the depth of the tracks, the direction of the tires, and the ground resilience, they realized the parking spot wasn't random. It was shielded by trees from the field, yet convenient for reaching the outer road. Possible escape routes included a residential street to the main part of town, a side road leading to the highway, and a little-used path heading west. Based on the tread pattern and turn angle, the most likely route led to the highway, an area that allowed quick acceleration and exit from town without passing through populated areas. That road had virtually no oversight at the time James disappeared, making it the most plausible getaway. When all the data was combined, the investigators saw a clear pattern: parking location, approach path, method of removing James, and escape route all pointed to advanced planning. There were no signs of confusion, no erratic movements or unnecessary stops, just a clean, sequential, consistent series of actions. The fact that the suspect waited for the exact moment James was alone, approached on foot instead of driving up, led the boy back without noise, and then left via a discreet route demonstrated a high level of control and calculation. These elements solidified the conclusion that this was a targeted abduction, not a child wandering off or a random lure. The limited but consistent evidence all pointed the same way: an adult had been watching, chose the perfect moment, and removed James from the area in the shortest possible time. This became the basis for the next steps, widening the search and narrowing suspects based on behavior, vehicle, and escape route. Initial assessments of the approach routes and exits from the ball field made expanding the search an urgent priority, and a large-scale search operation was promptly launched around the Chillicothe area. Police mobilized every available officer, combined with town volunteers, local rescue teams, and highway patrol units, to extend the search beyond the ball field. The effort was not limited to the roads leading to the highway. It pushed deep into residential neighborhoods, vacant lots, the lightly wooded areas surrounding the town, and seldom used trails. Search teams were divided by terrain. One handled residential areas and main roads. Another swept the northern woods, where kids often played. A third checked along the riverbank within driving distance. The remaining team covered open fields and the outskirts. Each team was tasked with noting any signs of vehicle movement, discarded items, or traces that could provide investigators with additional points of comparison. Breaking the area into smaller sectors allowed faster coverage while reducing the risk of missing key locations on the suspect's likely travel map. Meanwhile, highway patrol units checked every route out of town, including intersections, gas stations, overpasses, and any spot where a vehicle might have stopped. Truck drivers, residents living near the highways, and roadside business owners were all interviewed to determine whether they had seen a green Ford or an unfamiliar man on the afternoon of the incident. Several people reported seeing a vehicle matching the description, leaving Chillicothe, but the timing and direction were not clear enough for confirmation. Investigators continued to request assistance from roadblocks and neighboring police departments to screen vehicles matching the description, especially a green Ford, with features previously provided by witnesses. Vehicles inside the town were also inspected directly. Owners were asked to account for their use of the car on the afternoon James disappeared. A few vehicles that matched the color or style were quickly cleared due to solid alibis, while others were kept on a watch list for further verification. In addition, search teams expanded to vacant lots just outside town, places where a car could stop briefly without drawing attention. However, those areas showed only old traces, nothing recent connected to a child or an unusual stop. Teams also checked along the Scioto River, but found no tracks consistent with the suspect's likely route. In the sparse northern woods, searchers worked in zigzag patterns to cover ground hidden by brush, yet still turned up no signs pointing to James or the suspect vehicle. When the investigation team compiled results from all the search groups, a clearer but troubling picture emerged. There were no new clues indicating James was still anywhere near Chillicothe. Every exit route from town had been checked as quickly as possible, but the suspect's speed in leaving the scene made pursuit extremely difficult. If the car had merged into highway traffic, the chances of spotting it were minimal given 1950s traffic volume and the limited surveillance systems of the era. Vague witness reports of a green Ford were not precise enough to narrow the search, since the sighting times could be off by many minutes from when James was taken from the field. Vehicles of similar color or model traveling the highways that afternoon were common, adding significant noise to the information. As the teams returned and reported, the silence in each group reflected the initial deadlock. Efforts to block escape routes, screen vehicles, and search by terrain had yielded nothing useful. The critical early hours, the golden window for missing child cases, had been overshadowed by how quickly and discreetly the suspect fled the scene. Investigators realized that searching the immediate Chillicothe area was no longer producing leads, yet at that point they still had to recheck everything to ensure no clue was overlooked. The absence of any trace of James or the suspect vehicle forced them to confront a growing reality. If the boy was no longer in the area, every subsequent step would hinge on determining the suspect's initial direction of travel, because that was the only remaining direct link between James and the person who took him. With the wide search yielding no new leads, investigators turned back to the most valuable source of information available: the people who had been at the ball field the afternoon. James vanished. Reconstructing the full sequence of events immediately before he left the group became the next critical step. The team started with statements from the children who had been playing ball with James. The kids were questioned separately to avoid influencing one another. During this process, small but useful details began to surface. Some remembered James running to retrieve a ball after a bad hit. A few recalled seeing his shirt near the edge of the field. Others simply knew he went away for a bit and didn't come back. Notably, none of the children reported seeing James appear scared or arguing with an adult, and none heard any unusual sounds such as screams or calls. The absence of signs of resistance reinforced the belief that the approach happened very quickly and without drawing attention. Investigators paid special attention to the statement of Peter, James's best friend, who said James left his position just as Peter turned to check on the ball. Only a few minutes later, Peter realized James hadn't returned, but since the game continued, no one thought it was unusual. From this statement, investigators began pinning down the narrow window during which James separated from the group. A short span, but enough for a stranger to make contact. Once they had approximate timelines from the children, investigators moved on to residents living around the ball field. The most significant account came from Mrs. Chapman, who often watched the kids from her porch. She remembered seeing a man standing at the edge of the field for a few moments, not clearly looking at anyone, and when she stepped inside briefly and came back out, both the man and the green Ford that had been parked near the trees were gone. Another neighbor recalled a light green car driving slowly down the side street near the field, though he couldn't confirm the exact timing matched James's disappearance. These statements were documented and cross-referenced to establish a more precise timeline. Investigators organized the accounts into a sequential timeline: the ongoing ball game, the moment James separated from the group, the man's appearance according to Mrs. Chapman, and the car leaving the area, according to another witness. Cross-checking allowed them to identify overlapping time windows and narrow the period when the suspect likely approached James. Of course, witness statements always contained some margin of error, especially when most people only glimpsed events briefly and had no idea at the time that those details would matter in an investigation. The team therefore had to filter out noise, statements with mismatched times due to hazy memory, opinions based on guesswork rather than direct observation, and irrelevant details added because witnesses thought they might help. Removing the noise preserved only the solidly grounded data. As they rebuilt the timeline, a clear pattern emerged. James separated from the group for a very short time. The man appeared in the line of sight roughly at the same moment, and the car left the area after the man was no longer seen. The overlap of these three datasets, James leaving the group, the man's appearance, and the car's departure created a logical time frame that investigators could turn into a sequence of events. Although no witness directly saw the moment James got into the car, the alignment of the timelines allowed the reasonable inference that contact occurred within a few fleeting minutes. While the other children were focused on the game and nearby adults were not paying attention. Information from neighbors also reinforced the characteristics of the location the suspect chose. The least observed spot, a discreet yet convenient exit route, and a moment when the children were distracted. When all sources were combined, investigators were able to produce a fairly clear sketch of events. James left the group to retrieve a ball. The stranger approached at that moment. The green Ford was used to take him away from the field along a low-visibility route consistent with the tire tracks found. This reconstruction not only clarified the timeline, but also eliminated alternative theories such as James leaving voluntarily or simply taking a shortcut home. No statement supported those scenarios. On the contrary, every piece of collected data pointed to a single consistent narrative. James was deliberately approached in a window too brief to attract notice, and removed from the area via a pre-planned route. Reconstructing events in this way laid the groundwork for the next phase of analysis, in which investigators would focus on identifying the stranger and the vehicle involved in the entire incident. The data gathered from statements and the scene began to provide a foundation solid enough for investigators to sketch the first characteristics of the man seen near the ball field. The afternoon James disappeared. Although witnesses were not close and did not observe continuously, the scattered descriptions contained important points of agreement. Most recalled an average to tall build, not thin or frail, with a quick and purposeful stride. Some children described the man wearing a dark baseball cap, while Mrs. Chapman thought he wore a long-sleeved shirt, the color hard to determine in the late afternoon light. The frequency of these recurring details allowed investigators to form a preliminary profile. A white or slightly tanned male, approximately 5'9" to 6 foot, 1.75–1.83 Miller, likely aged 30 to 45, with a confident gait and deliberate behavior while scanning the area. No witness got a clear look at his face due to distance or the brevity of contact, but the man's repeated presence in the days prior, according to Mrs. Chapman and several other residents, suggested he was not just passing through but likely surveilling the area with intent. Alongside profiling the suspect, investigators compiled descriptions of the associated vehicle. Those who had seen the green Ford had relatively clear memories of the color light green or greenish silver, a common body style for Ford models from the late 19th. Some residents said the car looked older, with a rough-running engine and slight damage to the right rear fender. Though memories were not perfectly accurate, these points were sufficient to establish a working description. Light green Ford, 2- or 4-door sedan, likely manufactured 1940. Investigators compiled a list of every green Ford registered in Chillicothe and surrounding areas. Vehicle records at the time were basic and non-electronic, making cross-checking a slow manual process. Officers had to review each file individually, comparing license plates, owner addresses and any reports of theft or transfer. Many owners were contacted directly to verify where their vehicle was the afternoon James vanished. Some provided clear alibis in vehicles that did not match witness descriptions, shortening the list. However, others could not be verified immediately because the owner was unavailable or the car was no longer in original condition. During the cross-checking, investigators paid special attention to vehicles residents had reported seeing near the ball field on multiple consecutive days before the disappearance. The repeated presence of an unfamiliar car in the area was significant, as it suggested the driver may have been studying the children's routines, including James. A few statements specifically mentioned the green Ford parked near the spot where tire tracks were found, creating a direct link between the vehicle and the scene. As a result, the suspect vehicle list gradually narrowed to those cars that could not account for their location during the critical time or strongly matched the collected description. The list was not long, but every vehicle on it required thorough follow-up to determine relevance. Based on current evidence and statements, investigators began prioritizing, placing at the top those vehicles seen near the ball field on multiple days, especially any spotted the afternoon James disappeared. Although information remained limited and insufficient to identify the suspect by name, narrowing the pool of suspect vehicles was a major step forward given that physical clues were becoming harder to confirm with each passing day. From the combination of the suspect description, vehicle model, and repeated appearances at the ball field, investigators now had the first solid foundation for identifying the group of individuals most likely connected to James's disappearance, setting the stage for more focused analysis in the hunt for the perpetrator. Narrowing down the list of suspicious vehicles allowed the investigation team to move to the next step, identifying owners and screening those who might be connected. From the vehicles that matched the description and lacked clear alibis, they identified 4 men who became the primary suspects in the early phase. Each had a potential link to a green Ford or had been in the area around the time James disappeared. Once the list was formed, the next task was to examine each man's background and behavior to assess how well he fit the suspect profile. The first suspect was a man living on the outskirts of Chillicothe, described as reclusive and previously complained about by locals for watching children playing in the street. However, vehicle records showed the green Ford he once owned had been sold to someone else several months earlier. He stated he was home the day of the incident, and 2 neighbors confirmed it, significantly reducing his level of suspicion. The second suspect owned a small auto repair shop a few blocks from the ball field. He owned an older green Ford that matched the description, but inspection revealed no rear scratch as described by witnesses. Additionally, at the time James went missing, he was repairing a customer's car, and both the customer and employees confirmed his presence in the shop. The team noted it but did not fully eliminate him, as further cross-checking with other data was still needed. The third suspect was a long-haul truck driver who regularly passed through the Chillicothe area. He had a more complicated history, including recorded disturbances at bars and a short detention for threatening behavior. The vehicle he was using at the time was the same model as the described Ford, but the rear tire tread wear did not match the tracks at the scene. When interviewed, he said he had left Chillicothe before James disappeared to pick up a load in another state, but this needed verification through his route logs. The fourth suspect, Eldon Price, quickly drew more attention from investigators than the other. He moved between states, rarely stayed anywhere long, and was known for an unstable temperament and occasionally watching children from a distance in a disturbing way. Church members in a nearby town had reported him hanging around a children's playground for several days before suddenly disappearing. The vehicle he was driving at the time was reportedly an older light green Ford, but his registration records were unclear due to frequent private sales and transfers. When investigators compared witness descriptions of build and gait, Eldon Price matched more characteristics than the other 3. Similar height, quick walk, somewhat furtive appearance. However, since no witness got a clear look at the face, the match remained relative. The team had to continue verifying each man's alibi, a process made difficult by the very limited surveillance data available at the time. For the first and second suspects, alibis were confirmed by multiple people and by their documented activities that day. The third required cross-checking with trucking company route records, forcing investigators to contact the company. Eldon Price proved the most complicated because he had no fixed address during that period, making alibi verification especially difficult. Some people recalled seeing him in town that morning, but no one knew where he was in the afternoon. Although there was insufficient evidence to name him the perpetrator, the match in vehicle type, timing of presence, and history of watching children placed Price at the top of the watch list. When all factors from the 4 suspects were compiled, investigators realized no single individual had enough conclusive evidence to be considered the sole perpetrator. Each had points of fit and points of elimination. Some alibis appeared solid, others could not yet be verified, and none could be directly tied to the scene with clear evidence. As time passed, traces faded, and efforts to locate additional evidence reached a dead end. When the initial screening phase ended, the team faced the reality that there was too little evidence to move the case forward. The suspects remained on a watch list, but none met the threshold for charges or arrest, and the investigation began to slow even as efforts continued. The screening of the 4 suspects produced no breakthrough, so the team kept searching for any peripheral information that might help. In the process, they discovered a report from a West Virginia police department, noting a green Ford matching the description passing through a small town shortly after James disappeared. That report should have been forwarded to Chillicothe for comparison, but due to errors in interstate file transfer in the 1950s, still reliant on mail, typewriters, and manual processes, the information never reached the investigators in time. That lost report was, at the time, a critically important link. Had the team known a matching vehicle had left Ohio heading east, they could have expanded the search beyond the state instead of focusing only on Chillicothe and nearby towns. Because the lead was missed, the suspect's initial direction of travel was never confirmed, forcing investigators to rely entirely on scattered statements and assumptions. The absence of that interstate clue caused the investigation to gradually stall, with no new data to confirm or rule out existing theories. Efforts to match vehicles, locate owners, and extend the search to neighboring areas all hit dead end. Witness statements, while important, were too vague to effectively narrow the suspect pool. Meanwhile, none of the 4 original suspects had enough evidence to justify further detention or intensive questioning, creating a large gap in the case. As time passed, physical traces, such as tire tracks or direction of travel, became worthless, and with each passing day the chance of new information decreased. Initial public and media pressure was intense but faded as updates showed no progress. In the following years the file was reviewed periodically, but lack of evidence sent every effort back to square one. Eventually the case was officially moved to the unsolved category, or cold case per department procedure of the era. No suspect was prosecuted, no new physical evidence surfaced, and no additional statements emerged. The file was archived with countless other missing child cases, awaiting answers, hoping one day new technology or records might reopen overlooked clues. Though the official investigation stalled, the Walker family refused to give up. For years Henry and Lorraine sent letters to police departments in neighboring states, asking about unidentified children, or similar cases. They visited towns, inquired at churches and orphanages, hoping for even the smallest sign of James. Those efforts yielded no concrete answers, but stand as the clearest proof the family never stopped trying. Everything was blocked by one painful reality: no new evidence, no new statements, no new traces. The fragments never connected, and that is what allowed the case to slide into decades of frozen limbo. The years the missing person file lay frozen coincided with the period James began an entirely different life, under a new identity, a fact the Walker family had no way of knowing at the time. The boy was taken to a small family in Kentucky, the Turners, without any paperwork or information revealing his true origin. The Turners were simply told he was a child who needed care and they could adopt him if they agreed not to ask too many questions. In that era, informal child placements were not uncommon, especially in rural areas where social welfare systems were far less strict than in later decades. So they had no reason to suspect the boy they were raising was the victim of a decades-long missing child case. Renamed Michael Turner, the boy began adjusting to his new life on a small farm in rural Kentucky. The Turner family was kind, hard-working, and wanted to give Michael a real home. The environment was completely different from Chillicothe: quieter, fewer houses close together. Children spent most of their time doing farm chores or playing in open fields rather than on a town ball field. For Michael, everything felt natural, and memories of his previous life gradually grew distant. When he first arrived, he sometimes showed signs of unease, waking startled at night or sitting silently for hours, but at such a young age, those reactions did not form coherent memory. The Turners assumed he had been through some trauma, which was common among informally placed children at the time. They tried to make up for it with stability, regular routines, and small farm tasks that helped him feel he belonged. As years passed, Michael blended into the local community as if he had always lived there. He attended the nearby elementary school, made new friends, and grew familiar with the Kentucky accent and customs. Early traces of the Walker family, the Chillicothe ball field, old friends, or vague details of that final afternoon faded with each year. If fleeting unclear images surfaced, Michael could not tell whether they were real memories or childhood imagination. Most children move to a new environment before age 5 do not retain deep memories of their former life, and Michael was no exception. The Turners never suspected the truth about the boy's origins. They only knew Michael had come to them like an unexpected gift after years of being unable to have children. They raised him as their own, enrolled him in community activities, took him to church events, and let him grow up in a safe environment where no one ever mentioned his past. When Michael asked why he didn't have a birth certificate like his classmates, his adoptive parents said the papers had been lost when he was little, and they were working on replacements, an explanation that raised no suspicion in a child unfamiliar with bureaucracy. Occasional moments made him feel he didn't fully belong here, but those feelings were quickly filled by daily routine and the genuine care of the Turner family. Not knowing the truth about his past became the foundation of Michael's entire childhood and adulthood. He grew up unaware he had once had a different family, a different town, and an identity left behind on a ball field in Ohio. From the boy's perspective, Michael Turner's life began in Kentucky. Everything before existed only as scattered memory fragments too weak to form a complete story. Michael's stable life continued until he reached his teenage years, when administrative procedures and personal documents started becoming more necessary. Registering for a school sports tournament required an original birth certificate, and that was when the first inconsistencies in his identity began to surface. The Turner family gave Michael a copy of a birth certificate with faded ink that looked old, but did not match the standard administrative format used in Kentucky at the time. Everything on the paper, from the signatures to the style of the seal, drew attention from school staff. They asked Michael to submit additional documents for verification, but the Turners had nothing besides that faint sheet. When asked about childhood medical records, his adoptive parents only said everything got lost when we moved last year, an explanation that sounded reasonable but was backed by no evidence whatsoever. At first these gaps didn't bother Michael too much, but when teachers demanded vaccination records and medical history, things every child is supposed to have, he realized he was the exception, unlike any of his classmates. His medical file only started when he was around 3 or 4 years old. There was no documentation of his birth or newborn health checks, items every legally registered child possesses. The quiet sense of strangeness he had carried was now replaced by genuine confusion. When Michael asked his adoptive parents about his early childhood, they gave evasive answers. Sometimes papers were lost. Sometimes they said the adoption happened through an acquaintance no longer in contact. Other times they claimed he had been transferred from far away, so records were incomplete. Those inconsistent responses, instead of clarifying anything, made Michael feel something was being hidden. At first he thought his adoptive parents might be reluctant to talk about private adoption matters, but as he grew older, he realized the contradictions could not simply be mistakes. What struck him most was the complete absence of any photographs or memories from before he was about 3. The Turners had no baby pictures of him, and no keepsakes from that period. Every story about the time before remained vague, the kind fabricated to fill a void rather than drawn from real experience. Michael began watching his adoptive parents' reactions whenever he asked deeper questions. Their faces briefly tensed, their eyes averted, and their explanations suddenly became stiff. That shifted him from curiosity to suspicion. Not suspicion about their love for him, he never doubted that, but suspicion about the origin story they had told for years. The feeling that a thin but solid curtain was hiding an important part of his life became impossible to ignore. The suspicion did not stem from one single detail, but from the accumulation of numerous irregularities: an invalid birth certificate, missing early life medical records, contradictory answers, and inconsistencies in the adoption narrative. When his questions found no answers, Michael started thinking about investigating on his own. He compared the documents he had with publicly available official templates, and realized his birth certificate differed in more ways than he had thought. He also tried asking some adults in the community, people who had known the Turners when they first took him in, but their replies were equally vague. A few were even surprised to be asked about his origin. This was a clear sign the adoption story had never been widely shared, completely unlike a legal adoption that requires multiple procedures and witnesses. By the end of his teens, Michael understood that if he didn't search for the answers himself, no one would ever tell him the truth. The decision to investigate began to take shape, not because he wanted to leave the Turner family, but because he needed to know who he really was, where he came from, and why there were so many blanks in the story of his own life. The growing doubts forced Michael to confront his adoptive parents directly, and it happened one evening when all 3 of them could clearly feel the heavy atmosphere in the small house. When Michael asked once again about the documents, about the early years he could not remember at all, and why no one could provide a consistent story, the long silence from his adoptive father changed everything. Turner no longer looked like someone searching for a suitable excuse. He looked like a man who could no longer keep the secret. Finally, he sighed and admitted that Michael's origins had never been clear from the very first day the little boy was brought to them. He explained that many years earlier, when he and his wife were desperate to have a child and did not qualify for legal adoption through the state process, a local man known for finding children who needed homes approached them and offered help. The man was not part of any organization or social agency, yet he had the ability to deliver children to families who wanted to adopt without going through official channels. Turner described the transaction as quick and simple, with very few questions asked and absolutely no legal paperwork provided. All the man handed them was a child too young to speak, a few assurances that the baby's family couldn't keep him, and a request never to mention the matter to anyone else. At the time, their longing for a child and trust in the middleman made the Turners accept everything without realizing that decision would create countless unfillable gaps later. When Michael asked whether they knew where he came from or what his real name had been, his adoptive father could only shake his head. He confessed they had tried several times to get more information from the middleman, but the man disappeared just a few months after handing over the child, leaving them both with the child they had always wanted and with unease about raising a boy whose true circumstances they did not know. They chose silence because they believed the most important thing was that he lived safely and was loved. Turner's regret was evident as he admitted they too had been victims of ignorance and misplaced trust, but that could not change the fact that Michael had grown up inside an almost completely hidden story. His adoptive mother became emotional when Michael asked why they had never told him the truth, or at least what they did know or didn't know. She said they were afraid of losing him, afraid that if he learned he was neither their biological child, nor a legally adopted one, he would leave them. That fear had kept them silent for so long that they no longer knew how to speak when he started asking questions. Those confessions did not explain Michael's entire past, but they at least confirmed what he had long sensed. His origin story was anything but transparent, and the Turners, despite loving him, were not the people who held the answer. The truth emerged like a door finally relieved of a years-long burden, while simultaneously revealing the void Michael would now have to fill himself. Disorientation crept into his thoughts, yet at the same time a determination stronger than ever ignited. If his adoptive parents knew nothing more, if the documents revealed nothing, if his origin was simply a child handed off with no one knowing who he had been before, then there was only one way to find answers. Michael understood the time had come to search for his true identity on his own, not because he wanted to abandon the Turner family, but because he needed to know where his beginning actually was and why his life had been placed in others' hands in such a mysterious way. The adoptive parents' confessions did not bring the answers Michael hoped for, but they opened an entirely new path. If the Turners knew nothing about his origins, then only one place could possibly hold clues: the authorities. For months, Michael quietly researched missing children cases from the early 1950s, especially in states bordering Kentucky. His investigation was far from professional. He could only rely on the local library, old newspapers, and scattered public county archives, but patience led him to discover that the number of small child disappearances in that period was low, particularly in less populated states. Among the few publicly available records, the 1952 disappearance of a boy in Chillicothe, Ohio, stood out more than any other. The name James Walker appeared repeatedly in several old articles from the time, accompanied by details that made Michael uncomfortable. A 10-year-old child vanished from a ball field without a trace, possible connection to a green Ford car, and a large-scale search that yielded no results. The notes were sparse but highly suggestive, especially because many details matched or felt like they matched what Michael knew or vaguely sensed about his own life. Still, he had no evidence linking himself to the case. His name was Michael Turner, not James Walker. The year of birth on his faint certificate did not match James's age at the time of disappearance, and he could not recall any clear memory of a ball field or a town called Chillicothe. Nevertheless, stories of missing children often contain pieces distorted over time or by whoever took the child, so Michael could not rule out errors in recording or in the fake documents created for him when he was too young to remember. After some hesitation, he decided to take a bold step: contact the authorities in Ohio directly to ask about the decades-frozen missing person case. When he wrote to the Chillicothe Police Department, he simply explained that he was an adult questioning his own origins, that many details coincided with an old case, and that he wished to access to any public data available. What he did not expect was how quickly the response came. An investigator in the Cold Case Archives Unit showed immediate interest because it was extremely rare for someone to reach out about such an old missing child case, especially from the perspective of the possible victim himself. In the first exchange, Michael was asked numerous questions about childhood memories, where he grew up, his birth certificate, and medical history, all the biggest holes in his life story. Although he had no definitive answers, his honesty convinced the investigator this was not someone seeking random information, but a case with real potential connection to an actual missing person file. With approval from superiors, James Walker's missing person file was pulled from storage for the first time in over 40 years. Looking at the detailed records of the disappearance, Michael felt as if he were reading someone else's story, a story both foreign and yet strangely pulling him closer. Every detail in the file, James's age, height, hair color, the circumstances of the disappearance, the description of the green Ford, and the initial search efforts, left Michael suspended between intuition and reason. Nothing proved he was James, but nothing allowed him to dismiss the possibility either. The most important task now was to compare what Michael knew or sensed about himself with the data in the file. Certain vague memories of a dirt road, children shouting, the smell of dry grass, and a green vehicle that appeared in scattered childhood dreams suddenly became significant. For years Michael had thought they were mere imagination, but matching them against the file contents showed many fragments fit the Chillicothe setting far better than the Kentucky area where he was raised. When the investigator asked whether he had any childhood photos or belongings that could be compared, Michael replied he possessed nothing at all from before the Turners. That detail increased Ohio's interest, because it is a common indicator in cases of children moved through illegal channels. As communication progressed, a crucial question arose. Was Michael willing to submit to a DNA test to compare against samples previously provided by the Walker family to missing person databases? Michael knew this step was irreversible. A match would upend his entire life. A negative result would force him to keep searching elsewhere. But after so many years living among disconnected fragments, he had only one path left to get closer to the truth. The thought did not make him hesitate for long. In the final call of that day, Michael requested the DNA test, the most critical step to determine whether his life had truly begun on an afternoon in 19. The decision to request a DNA test shifted everything from vague speculation to a clear scientific investigation process. As soon as Michael agreed, the investigator in Ohio directed him to an authorized lab near where he lived to collect samples following standard procedure. The samples included a buccal swab, hair samples, and 2 additional reference samples to ensure accuracy. Everything was coded and sent to the central lab of the state of Ohio, where DNA samples from the Walker family members, submitted years earlier in hopes of one day finding the truth, were stored. While waiting for the results, Michael went through a series of long days with emotions swinging between hope, anxiety, and doubt. Claiming to himself that he might be James Walker was still something he didn't dare say out loud, even to himself. Despite the many coincidences, he was afraid those clues were just random chance, that he was only trying to fit himself into a story to fill the void in his memory. At the same time, he also understood that if this result couldn't answer the question of his identity, there would likely be no other method strong enough to do so. When the DNA samples arrived in Ohio, the Identification Analysis Unit performed a series of comparisons with the genetic samples of the surviving Walker family members, including James's full siblings, who had persisted in hope despite the case being frozen for. The lab used kinship matching based on genetic marker analysis, a technique that can confirm parent-child or sibling relationships even without direct samples from the parents. In James's case, both parents had passed away, but the DNA from his full siblings remained an extremely valuable data source. As the first genetic bands appeared, the technicians noticed an unusual level of similarity. Many markers matched perfectly, while others fell within the range consistent with full siblings. The preliminary analysis showed the probability that Michael was not biologically related to the Walker family was virtually zero. This was a degree of match that only occurs in direct biological relationships. After running a second cross-check to rule out technical error, the lab issued the official conclusion: Michael Turner's DNA matched the DNA of the Walker family. In other words, Michael was James Walker, the boy who disappeared from Chillicothe. When the news was relayed to the investigator and then to Michael, he could barely speak. Part of him felt it was too unbelievable, because it meant his life, what he thought he knew, what he had tried to piece together, was only half of the real picture. But beneath the shock was a profound sense of relief. After years of wondering who he was and why his past was a blank space, he finally had a clear answer. James Walker had not vanished from the world that afternoon. He had lived, grown up, and become a man named Michael Turner, without ever knowing his true story. The DNA result not only confirmed his identity, but immediately changed the legal status of the case. Once the victim was determined to be alive, the cold case file of more than 40 years was instantly reopened for a full re-examination of every detail, from the disappearance itself, the motive, to the path by which James had been taken out of Ohio. State authorities updated the records, added new information, and transferred the case to a specialized long-term missing persons unit with experience in decades-old disappearance. Finding James after so many years was not only a major event for the Walker family, but also a turning point for the system handling backlogged cases. For Michael, or more accurately James, this was only the beginning of reconnecting with a past he thought had vanished forever. The DNA result confirming Michael was James Walker forced the entire Ohio investigative system to return to a file that had seemingly been dormant for over 4 decades. The cold case team was mobilized to re-examine every document, starting with the old physical evidence stored in the county archives. Sealed envelopes containing tire tread sketches, crime scene photos, notes about adult shoe prints, and the location where the baseball card was found were pulled out for reanalysis. Although most physical evidence from that era no longer held forensic value due to the passage of time, it remained crucial for reconstructing the initial route the suspect used to take James from the ball field. The team used 1950s maps of Chillicothe, cross-referencing roads, trails, and original terrain, while comparing them to routes that still exist today. When the evidence was placed back on the map in the exact recorded positions, a clearer pattern of movement emerged: tire direction, the man's sighting location, the walking distance from the car to James, and the exit route, all aligned with the local layout of that time. The fact that James was found alive provided a wealth of new data to fill gaps the 1952 investigators could not resolve. Although James had no clear memory of the moment he was taken, details about his age when he arrived at the Turner home, the fact he brought no belongings from the Walker family, and that he was handed over to a family in another state through an illegal intermediary created a strong link between the hypothesized escape route and the new evidence. These facts pushed the team to rescreen the original suspect list. The 4 suspects considered back then were brought back to the table, but this time the data was examined from the perspective of a successful kidnapping, meaning the suspect had to be capable of leaving the state in a very short time and evading pursuit in Ohio. 3 of the original suspects had alibis or limited travel range. They lived and worked in areas where quickly crossing state lines was unlikely, and updated records showed no history of interstate travel. By contrast, Eldon Price's file stood out dramatically when compared with the new data. Price had moved between neighboring states, had no fixed job, and frequently appeared and disappeared during irregular periods. Reports of him watching children from a distance previously noted by locals were now evaluated far more seriously because they matched the grooming behavior seen in planned abductions. The most significant value in re-evaluating suspects came from the escape route data. When authorities combined the route map from Chillicothe to western West Virginia, where a green Ford had been reported missing but not properly routed in 1952, they discovered the path perfectly matched the exit direction inferred from the night. The geography allowed a car to cross the state line in under an hour on a quiet afternoon. That route also had many unmonitored stretches where a suspect could stop or hand the child to an intermediary undetected. Extending the map further revealed a route from West Virginia could reach Kentucky in a relatively short time, especially using back roads instead of highways. James appearing in Kentucky as an undocumented child fit perfectly with the theory that he was moved in stages from Ohio to West Virginia, and then to Kentucky. The team expanded its scope to the involved states, contacting authorities in West Virginia and Kentucky to re-examine old reports related to suspicious vehicles, child intermediaries, and individuals suspected of illegal child trafficking in the. Retrieving information from that era was limited by inconsistent record keeping, but scattered reports of strange vehicles and a drifter matching the suspect's description near small towns along the route aligned with the time frame the suspect could have been moving James. This reinforced the theory that the kidnapping was not a spur-of-the-moment act, but a calculated series of movements based on knowledge of interstate routes and the ability to evade local pursuit. With the new data and the combination of old scene analysis, travel routes, and human factors, the investigative team now had a much stronger foundation to continue piecing together the remaining parts of James Walker's disappearance. The reinvestigation data showed the escape route, direction of travel, and ability to remove James from Ohio in a very short window, all matched the behavior pattern of someone experienced with interstate movement, making the name Eldon Price, already prominent on the original suspect list, the central focus of the cold case team. When Price's file was pulled from storage, the review process was far more thorough than it had been 4 decades earlier. Records showed Price was a man with no fixed address, frequently taking seasonal jobs in small towns and moving constantly, either for work or simply because he didn't stay anywhere long. That lifestyle fit the profile of individuals who could easily slip away from community oversight while having opportunities to scout new areas unnoticed. Investigators noted that in scattered reports from other towns, Price had been complained about for lingering near playgrounds or places where children gathered, behavior that at the time was often dismissed as odd but not suspicious enough. When investigators compared witness descriptions from Chillicothe with photos of Price in the file, the match became significant. Height within the estimated range, similar build and gait, and the habit of wearing a hat and long-sleeved shirts to cover his body also appeared in sightings in other states. Though no witness got a clear look at the suspect's face on the day James vanished, the consistency in physical identifiers made Price the most logical choice when reconstructing the abductor's appearance. The team dug deeper into Price's travel history. Old documents, including work receipts, local police notes, and short detention records, showed Price had been in the Chillicothe area weeks before James disappeared. Around the time of the incident, records placed him doing temporary repair work not far from the ball field. Yet just days after the disappearance, Price's trail vanished from Ohio and next surfaced in a small West Virginia town, an astonishing match with the direction of the green Ford reported but never properly followed up in. The driving time between the two locations was only a few hours, perfectly aligning with the timeline the team had reconstructed earlier. Expanded data into Kentucky also showed sporadic sightings of Price near the border during the same period, though without specific dates or reason. The overlap between Price's travels and the suspected abductor's route became too clear to be coincident. Every geographic marker, Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, was documented in Price's file in an order that matched the path the abductor likely took, making Price stand far above any remaining suspect. When analyzing Price's movement habits, investigators realized he not only traveled often, but tended to leave an area right after any incident that might draw attention to him. That was exactly the behavior pattern of an offender avoiding detection: approach the target, leave the area quickly, and never return to the crime scene. The task force compared motive, opportunity, and means for each original suspect. The other 3, though thoroughly considered at the time, showed no evidence of ever leaving Ohio or appearing in the relevant states during that period. Their records were far more stable: steady jobs, clear social ties, and most had strong alibis that removed them from consideration. In contrast, Price was the only one with documented presence in the key locations at the right times. The ability to operate a suitable vehicle, a history of watching children, and a lifestyle that allowed him to disappear from oversight with minimal trace. All the evidence formed a unified picture. Though there was no direct proof, Price was the best fit for the suspect profile. When investigators sought more recent sources to learn about Price's later life, they discovered he had died years earlier in a medical facility in another state, recorded as a homeless person with no known relatives. This ended any possibility of interrogation or direct confrontation for answers. Price's death also confirmed something that made the case even more bitter. Even though every trail led to a single suspect, the justice system cannot prosecute the dead, and the chance of obtaining a confession or critical details from him was gone forever. While no absolute legal conclusion was possible, given the re-examined and cross-referenced evidence spanning decades, The investigative team believed Eldon Price was the person most likely responsible for taking James from Chillicothe. The flood of evidence pointing to Eldon Price and the matching travel timelines forced the investigative team to fully reconstruct the journey that took James out of Chillicothe in 1952, a journey that had previously existed only as scattered hypotheses but now had enough pieces to form a complete reconstruction. Began at the clearest starting point, the ball field where James vanished. Based on tire tracks, the time of approach, and the direction of departure, the suspect vehicle most likely took a back road out to the edge of town, then merged onto the route connecting Ohio and West Virginia. At that time it was a lightly traveled road with little oversight, allowing a vehicle to cross state lines quickly without passing through any official checkpoints. When old maps were cross-referenced with the timing data in Price's records, the team discovered that the Ohio-West Virginia-Kentucky route was not only feasible, but almost perfectly matched the locations where Price had appeared in the early. The distance between Chillicothe and the small West Virginia town, where the green Ford had once been reported but the record later went missing, was only a few hours' drive, consistent with the suspect leaving the scene immediately after contacting James. The fact that the car appeared in West Virginia at exactly that time, a detail unknown to the 1952 investigators, became a critical link showing that James was removed from Ohio that same afternoon or evening. Notably, the West Virginia report described the car moving slowly through a residential area, as if the driver was looking for directions or a place to stop, behavior that matched Price's pattern in other towns where he had briefly stayed. Extending the route southward into Kentucky, the team found that numerous towns along the continuation from West Virginia had recorded sporadic sightings of Price during the same period. Some reports from local churches described a drifter asking for a few days' work before disappearing, with descriptions of long-sleeved shirts, a quick gait, and a closed-off demeanor identical to Price's known appearance. These markers formed logical connecting points for a journey that carried James across multiple states without leaving obvious traces. The next critical piece was determining when and how James was handed off to the intermediary, who later delivered him to the Turner family. Though no direct evidence existed, the fact that the boy appeared in Kentucky at a very young age, with no belongings or paperwork, and was passed along to the Turners by a man not affiliated with any welfare agency, indicated that James was not with Price for long. The team hypothesized that Price kept James for no more than a few days. Instead, he likely handed the boy over to someone else at a stop in West Virginia or Kentucky, places where informal, illegal child trading networks were known to operate, even if never officially documented. These networks did not follow a clear organizational model, but relied on individual middlemen who moved between small towns, approaching families who wanted to adopt but did not want, or could not go through legal channels. This kind of unofficial transaction happened quietly, enabled by the lack of oversight in the legal system of that era, especially in poor rural areas, where paperwork was rarely scrutinized. Viewed through this lens, James appearing in Kentucky within a short time after leaving Ohio made perfect sense. His extremely young age when he arrived at the Turners, too young to remember anything, was another indicator that the handoff happened quickly. Information from the Turner family further supported this theory. They never knew the child's origin, only that he came from an unidentified middleman, who told them not to ask too many questions. This was typical of transactions in illegal networks, where the motive was not always money, but sometimes simply the desire to be rid of responsibility after a kidnapping. Assessing the motives of the middleman network became an important part of the analysis. In the social context of the 1950s, informal adoptions were far more common than today. Drifters or transients like Price could easily participate in child trading for cash, or simply to eliminate evidence after committing a crime. The team found no indication that Price ever intended to keep James long-term. Instead, his pattern of rapid movement and lack of attachments suggested that passing James off was his way of severing all ties to the child as quickly as possible. From there, the picture of the journey became clear. A drifter in a green Ford, who had been spotted in Chillicothe days earlier, approached James the moment he was separated from his friends, left town via low-visibility road, passed through West Virginia, where a now-lost report had once placed the car, and continued into Kentucky, where the child was handed to an off-the-books middleman. Though direct evidence had faded over decades, the route was reinforced by the alignment of geography, timing and behavior, allowing the team to reconstruct one of the most crucial segments of a disappearance that had lasted. Successfully reconstructing the route that took James out of Ohio completed a major step, but the next one was far more significant, contacting the Walker family to inform them that the person they had lost for 4 decades had not only been identified, but was alive and living under a different name. Though the news carried hope, it was treated as extremely sensitive, because it could upend the emotions of relatives who had lived nearly their entire lives in mourning. The investigator handling the case first contacted Linda Walker, James's older sister, who still lived in Ohio and had submitted DNA samples multiple times over the years to aid the search. When she received the call, she initially assumed it was just another routine update, something the family had experienced many times before, always without new information. However, when the investigator asked to meet in person rather than discuss it over the phone, Linda sensed that something important was coming. The meeting took place at the Chillicothe Police Headquarters, where she arrived with her 2 surviving younger siblings. In a small conference room, the investigator placed the DNA test file on the table and walked them through the comparison process between the Walker family's genetic samples and those from the man known as Michael Turner. Every step was explained clearly and precisely so they would understand that this was not speculation, but a scientific conclusion with near absolute certainty. When they heard the words "James is alive," Linda could not hold back her tears. For 41 years she had lived with the memory of her little brother vanishing from the ball field, and the unending guilt of never knowing what happened to him. Learning that the boy had not died, had not been left alone somewhere, but was still alive in the world, was too much to take in all at once. The rest of the family reacted similarly, a mixture of shock, joy, and disbelief. After the initial wave of emotion, they began asking questions about James's life, how he had lived, whether he had been safe, whether he had a family or children of his own. The investigator could only answer within the limits allowed, because James, or Michael, still needed privacy and time to prepare mentally before facing the family he had never known. Once emotions settled, the next step was preparing for additional confirmation. Although the DNA test was conclusive, authorities wanted to ensure the reunion happened with total clarity and without causing excessive shock to either side. The Walker family was shown some of the documents Michael had provided: fragmented childhood memories, signs of memory gaps, the timing of his appearance in Kentucky, and details about the middleman who delivered him. Everything lined up perfectly with the theory that James had been moved through multiple states before reaching the Turners. To prepare for the meeting, the team contacted Michael again, informing him that the Walker family had been told and confirmed they wanted to meet him whenever he was ready. They explained that the reunion would take place in a safe environment, with psychological support and law enforcement presence to ensure neither side became overwhelmed. Michael listened to every word, fully aware that the moment he had waited for, though never dared name, was finally here. The reunion was not just about facing people who shared his blood, it was the first step in reclaiming the part of his life that had been stolen. When asked if he wanted to proceed, Michael replied that this was something he needed to do, not only for himself, but for the family who had lost him so long ago. The Walker family, after receiving all necessary information, formally agreed to the reunion, believing that their 41 years of waiting could finally end with the answer they had always sought. The Walker family's agreement to reunite marked the most significant turning point since James disappeared, and authorities began preparing for the official meeting between the two sides. The encounter was held in a special activity room at the Chillicothe Police Headquarters, a private, quiet space arranged to ensure emotional safety for both the Walker family and James. When Michael, or James, stepped into that room, he carried a mixture of anxiety and excitement, as if he were walking into a part of his life he had never been allowed to touch. On the other side, Linda and James's 2 younger siblings stood up the moment the door opened. They looked at the middle-aged man before them with a blend of shock and recognition. Though time had changed the face, the build, and the way the 10-year-old boy once saw the world, certain features were unmistakable. The eyes, the eyebrow line, and even the fleeting, awkward smile, all of it made Linda feel as though she were seeing her brother's image from dreams she had carried for decades. In the first steps toward each other, no one could speak. The emotions were too strong, making the air in the room almost suffocating. Finally, Linda broke the distance by reaching out to lightly touch James's shoulder, and a moment later they embraced tightly, as if trying to make up for 41 years that could not be put into words. James's siblings quickly joined, forming a reunion moment whose weight of time anyone present could feel. After those initial tear-filled minutes, they sat down and began talking, slowly, cautiously, but deeply. The Walker family had brought old photographs of James as a child. When the pictures were placed in front of him, the familiar features became clearer than ever. James looked at his own face from 4 decades earlier, and felt as though he were seeing a stranger who was nevertheless deeply connected to him. Small details, the cowlick in his hair, the faint scar on his knee, the slight tilt in his stance that James had never remembered, were instantly confirmed by the family. This was considered the final direct identification step, completely solidifying the conclusion that the man before them was indeed the boy who vanished in night. With the truth now beyond any doubt, the Walker family began sharing with James what their lives had been like during his absence. They spoke of their parents, who had lived out their remaining years clinging to the fragile hope that their son was not dead, even though they never knew where he was. They described the relentless searches, the trips across neighboring states, and the letters sent to authorities in the hope that one day someone would answer. In every story, James could feel the love and the pain his family had carried, and he understood that his disappearance had not just been a case file, but an unfillable void in the hearts of those who loved him. For James, the reunion brought both happiness and heartache. He knew his life had unfolded differently because he was taken from Ohio so young, but what weighed on him most was that his birth parents had passed away without ever seeing him again. Still, knowing his family had never stopped loving him helped him face that pain more gently. As the meeting progressed, the investigators and psychologists observed from a distance, giving the family space to reconnect. They only stepped in when necessary to ensure neither side became overwhelmed. Regarding the media, news of a 41-year-old missing person case being solved spread quickly. Though authorities tried to protect James's and the family's privacy, the rarity of the case drew local newspapers and television stations seeking details. They wanted to know, how could a boy missing since the early 1950s have survived, grown up and been found after more than 4 decades? Authorities issued official statements to prevent rumors, while confirming that the reunion was real. That James Walker, the boy who had mysteriously vanished, had returned to his birth family. For the Walker family, that reunion was the moment their lifelong dream became reality. James had finally come home, no longer just a name in a missing person file, but a living, breathing person sitting in front of them, alive and present after a 41-year journey that had been stolen from them. The reunion with the Walker family gave James a sense of wholeness he hadn't felt in decades, but it also ushered in a new phase filled with challenges, especially a lingering identity conflict. From childhood through adulthood, he had lived and grown up as Michael Turner, a name tied to his memories, friends, job and relationships he cherished. Now, however, James Walker was no longer just a name on a file. It was part of the truth about who he really was. What confused him most was the feeling that he had 2 parallel lives, one that began in Ohio that he couldn't remember, and one in Kentucky that he was still living. Balancing these 2 worlds was anything but simple. The Turner family, the people who had raised him with unconditional love, now faced the fear of losing the person they considered their own son. They didn't stop James from connecting with the Walkers, but the unease in their eyes was impossible to hide. Meanwhile, the Walker family, having just found their long-lost relative, wanted to make up for lost time, to be close, to have James belong to the place where he was born. James stood in the middle, unwilling to hurt anyone and equally unwilling to deny any part of his life. To help him adjust psychologically, authorities arranged counseling sessions with specialists experienced in long-term missing person reunion. In those sessions, James learned to accept that the truth didn't require him to choose a side, but rather to find a way to integrate both parts of his life into a single whole. He was guided to see that Michael Turner was the person he had lived as and become, while James Walker was his origin. The personal history returned to him after years of being hidden. Merging the 2 identities didn't happen overnight. It was a long and sometimes painful process. James began splitting his time between the 2 families, weekends in Ohio to learn more about his biological parents and the childhood he couldn't recall, and weekdays in Kentucky to maintain his job and familiar life. Each place carried its own meaning. Ohio reminded him of his roots, while Kentucky was where he had been shaped into an adult. Despite the demanding schedule, James felt it was necessary to avoid abandoning any part of himself. During this period he also had to update countless things: personal documents, legal name, medical history, financial records. Authorities helped him update his identity, but he alone had to decide whether to keep the name Michael, switch to James, or keep both. It wasn't a simple choice. Michael was the real life he had lived. James was the truth he had just reclaimed. In the end, James chose a dual legal name, James Michael Walker, as a way to honor both families and both identities. As he rebuilt his life, he also spent time exploring his past on his own, looking at old photos, talking with his sister, visiting the old house, the old school, and the ball field where he disappeared. These experiences helped James reshape his personal identity, no longer seeing himself as two different people, but as one person with two journeys. One interrupted, the other continued without explanation. The more he understood, the clearer it became that the reunion didn't just close a painful chapter for the Walker family. It also opened an opportunity for him to understand and complete himself after 41 years living with a void. The investigation team still had to face a different reality. Although the victim's identity had been confirmed, and James's journey out of Ohio had been largely reconstructed, the case still contained many mysteries that could never be fully resolved. The biggest question revolved around the suspect's motive. That Eldon Price was the person who took James fit all available data, but why he did it remained pure speculation. There was no evidence he ever had a conflict with the Walker family, nor any trace that he was part of an organized kidnapping ring. His behavior watching children from a distance and moving constantly suggested possible deviant tendencies or mental instability, but the specific motive remained an unfillable gap. Additionally, the fact that James was handed off to an unidentified middleman strongly indicated Price had not acted alone. A drifter could have taken James across state lines, but delivering the child to a Kentucky family in a quick handoff and disappear manner suggested a loose network of people involved in illegal child trafficking or exchange. Although no official records documented such activity in the area during the 1950s, scattered reports from neighboring states mentioned small groups that brokered illegal adoptions. James ending up with the Turners through a mysterious middleman fit that pattern. The possibility of additional victims also arose when investigators reviewed missing child reports from the same period. A few scattered disappearances appeared within the radius of nearby states, though there wasn't enough data to link them directly to Price. His travel patterns and behavior prevented investigators from ruling out that James was not the only case. The lack of information from that era made comparisons limited, especially since many records were lost or incomplete. This led to a larger issue. Gaps in the original case file meant some parts of the story could never be fully reconstructed. In 1952, authorities failed to record the middleman's identity, seize the suspect's vehicle, receive a timely report from West Virginia, or obtain an accurate description of the moment James was taken. Every missing link closed a door, forcing the entire picture to rely on inference rather than direct evidence. Even the reconstructed journey relied on indirect data such as Price's appearances in neighboring states, scattered witness accounts of strange vehicles, and known patterns of middleman networks at the time. All of these elements pointed to a reasonable direction, but could not provide absolute answers to every detail. Therefore, although the case was solved in a legal sense, the victim's identity confirmed, the victim alive, the most likely suspect identified, it was never a fully clarified case. No one would ever know exactly what happened in the moment of the abduction. No one knew what Price intended to do with James. No one knew who the middleman was or what network he belonged to, and no one knew whether other children suffered the same fate. Those questions became the remaining shadows of the case, a reminder that some mysteries belonged to an era when records, witnesses, and legal systems were not strong enough to capture the full truth. The case closed with James's reunion with his family, but it left permanent gaps in history, parts that no matter how hard anyone tried, could never be completely pieced together. The mysteries that could never be fully resolved forced the investigation team to reflect on the entire process from a deeper perspective, and in doing so, the James Walker case became clear evidence of how far criminal investigation techniques had advanced over the decades. From the moment James was confirmed alive, investigators realized that the single decisive factor in breaking a 41-year wall of silence was modern DNA technology. Without genetic matching, Without the lab storing the Walker family's data, and without the National Information Sharing System, James's identity might have remained forever buried under the name Michael Turner. The case became a textbook example of how DNA does not just help catch perpetrators, it is often the only way to restore identity to people missing across generations. Thanks to DNA, a case once considered hopeless was completely transformed, proving that modern technology can rewrite the history of cases thought long buried. Equally important was the value of record preservation, something generations of investigators could not fully foresee. The notes, crime scene photos, witness statements, and even faded tire tracks from decades ago all became crucial pieces in reconstructing the case. Had any part of those records been destroyed or lost, connecting the dots between Ohio, West Virginia, and Kentucky would have been nearly impossible. The James Walker case thus became a powerful reminder that preserving records is not merely procedural, it is the bridge between past and future, between missed justice and the chance to correct it decades later. On a societal level, James's disappearance and the journey to find him sparked deep discussions about child safety. In the 1950s, lax supervision, lack of awareness toward strangers, and fragmented reporting systems created conditions for abductions to occur without leaving traces. James's story has been incorporated into community training programs and school discussions as a historical example, reminding people that although safety standards are vastly improved today, risks still exist if vigilance is taken for granted. The Chillicothe community, where the incident occurred, was also profoundly affected when the case was reopened and resolved. Residents who witnessed the 1952 search or heard about it from family felt a piece of collective memory revived. Local newspapers retold the story not to stir sadness, but to affirm that even cases thought abandoned can still find answers if the community and authorities remain persistent. Finding James became a widely shared story that reignited vigilance, while nurturing belief that justice can arrive no matter how late. The greatest significance of the case lies in the hope that endured across generations. The Walker family, despite enormous loss, never completely gave up. They kept submitting DNA samples, kept asking questions, kept believing that somewhere James was still alive. That persistence connected all the pieces: old archived files, misplaced reports, the reconstructed journey, and the DNA. Their story became living proof that hope, no matter how fragile or quiet, has the power to lead to truth. For families with missing loved ones, the James Walker case delivers a profound message. Time may blur traces, but it cannot erase the chance of reunion. Sometimes all it takes is one new technology, one preserved record, or one person brave enough to question their own identity. The James Walker case didn't just end a 41-year journey for a little boy taken away. It opened a new perspective on responsibility, perseverance, and the power of hope. A power that can outlast an entire life. The lasting significance the James Walker case left for both the community and the justice system made closing this file more symbolic than a mere investigative formality. After 41 years, the story that began on a quiet afternoon at a Chillicothe ball field had come full circle from disappearance, lost leads, stalled investigation, frozen file, to DNA technology, finally bringing the truth back to light. That journey not only restored James's identity, but also corrected a piece of justice delayed far too long. The case's impact on the justice system is most evident in how agencies began re-examining cold cases. It proved that a case can be solved, not because of when it happened, but because of the ability to connect information across generations. As a result, many police departments started reviewing old cold cases, uploading DNA to national databases, and re-examining reports previously dismissed due to technological limitations of the era. James's story led to changes in how clues are received and stored, especially in interstate cases where a single missing report could derail an investigation for decades. Nevertheless, the case still left open questions that can never be fully answered. Eldon Price's true motive can only be guessed. The identity of the middleman who took James and any network he belonged to will never be known. And whether other children traveled the same path remains an unresolved question mark. Those gaps became part of the story, reminding us that not every truth can be illuminated, especially for incidents that occurred in an age lacking data and oversight mechanism. Yet those very unanswered questions offer an important lesson for other cold cases. Every detail, no matter how small, can be the key. Every archived file, no matter how faded, retains value as science advances, and every family that keeps hope alive may hold the final piece needed to break a case. The James Walker case was closed legally, but it never truly ends in its social and emotional meaning. It remains a cautionary tale, a source of inspiration, and a reminder that justice sometimes arrives late, but does not necessarily disappear. For James, his 41-year journey is recorded not as a chain of tragedy, but as proof of human resilience and the ability to rebuild a life even when the past has been stolen. For the Walker family, the reunion closed a decades-long circle of pain and opened a future where the truth, however late, has finally been found. The case is filed away in archives stamped resolved, but its story will live on as part of the history of perseverance, science, and hope that never die. Looking back at James Walker's 41-year journey in the context of today's America, this is not just a moving true crime story, it is a very real reminder of how we protect our families, trust the system, and proactively use modern tools to seek the truth. The abduction began with what seemed like a harmless detail: a child allowed to play unsupervised at a Chillicothe football field, while a strange green Ford had been appearing for days. Today in the U.S., kids still go to parks and fields, but the lesson is clear: safety doesn't happen by itself. Parents don't need to raise children in fear, but they must notice repeated unusual patterns around their kids, like a strange car or an adult with no clear reason to be there. On the system side, the lost report in West Virginia shows that one gap in interstate coordination was enough to derail an investigation for decades. Today, as databases become more interconnected, citizens can be proactive, keep documents, submit missing person information to national systems, and don't hesitate to contact multiple agencies if a family file seems forgotten. The story of James Michael also touches on adoption. The Turners meant no harm, but accepting a child through an off-the-books middleman unwittingly aided a crime. In today's context, it's a reminder that adoption or caring for minors must go through legal, transparent channels that respect a child's right to know their origins. Finally, the fact that James questioned his birth certificate, dared to get a DNA test, and reached out to Ohio shows that in modern American society, every individual has both the right and the tools to seek the truth about themselves, and sometimes, changing an entire cold case starts with simply daring to ask the question. Thank you for joining me to the end of this 41-year journey, full of loss but also full of hope. If you found the story meaningful, please hit subscribe to keep exploring cold cases reopened by the power of time and justice with me. See you in the next video, where we'll continue searching for the truth in stories once thought lost to oblivion.